could say that we're still exploring the place it's said that we arrive at when we no longer need to try. But the other day it was said yet again that we have to become divine scientists, divine physicists, divine alchemists, and also divine psychologists. So if we're going to explore something, we should explore it from the place of each of these qualities. So in our stories, we've already looked at the physics of this place, the science of this place, the chemistry of this place. And with the story the other day of the young man and losing his leg, you could say that we're looking at the divine psychology of it. But there's a story, an old story, that sums it all up for us and brings in this divine psychology. So let's see, when we bring it to a personal level from our own experience, whether we too can glean what it is, the deep meaning of the divine psychology of being in a place where we no longer need to try brings. And it's one of those stories in a time long ago, in a place far away. There was a man leading his donkey into a small village, and the sounds of the donkey had the sounds of ringing and kind of clanging, because in the saddlebags of the donkey were the tambourines and the balls, the baubles that were used by a juggler in plying his art. So as this man walked into town, and he wasn't young and he wasn't old, there were flecks of grey in the side of his temples. But as he came into town, as was his usual way, he checked the area. There, the town square, and at the end of the town square there was a little dilapidated church. There was the shopkeeper leaning against his post, smoking a cigarette, watching the people go by. There were the young people wheeling their babies along the street. So having viewed this scene, he chose a suitable spot to unpack those things that a juggler uses. So laying out his sheet on the ground, he took out his implements to make the juggling, the tambourines and the sounds that would draw the people in. And then he took out his old purple tights, drew them on his legs, and the worn velvet jacket that he wore, and that jester's cap with all the bells on the end, that when he shook his head, they tinkled, and the children loved the sounds. So people already started to gather. The storekeeper, who'd been smoking his cigarette, looked and said, "Oh, look, we're going to have some entertainment." And this drew people in also. So he started his art and started to juggle. But first of all, he blew on his little flute a few notes that drew the children and the people in, and then he started his act. And the people drew around, and the children began to laugh at his antics. And so it went on that many, many people came. The women with their children, the storekeepers, came around, and some even put a few coins in the hat that he'd placed in front of his sheet. But the day wore on, and suddenly the church bell rang. It was time for the Mass to take place. And so, immediately, the people started to move away. Some put a coin or two into the hat, and then they shuffled off to the church. So he packed up all his gear. Excuse me. Why did I choose a longer story? Excuse me. And then he heard the sounds of the people singing in the church. And just as he was to take his donkey and lead it away, having gathered up the coins that were there that would give him a night's lodging, he was drawn into the church. He sat right at the back and heard the sermon of the old priest. And he watched as the old priest greeted everyone who left the church. But he remained sitting at the back till the old priest came around, looked at him, greeted him, and said, "You look like a traveling man." And the juggler said yes, telling the priest what he did. And the priest said, "You must have been to many places and met many people." The juggler, with a tired sigh, said yes. So the old priest sat down beside the juggler, and he said, "Winter is coming. What do you do when winter comes and the people do not gather in the streets?" So the juggler responded, "It is a sad time for me." The old priest said, "Why don't you stay a while?" The juggler said, "What will I do?" The old priest said, "I have a garden. I have a garden that needs tending. Will you help me? Now I'm old and not able to do what I did before." The juggler thought for a moment. Yes, the winters were long and hard, and not too many coins were put in his hat during the days when the snow was on the ground. So he agreed, and he went to live in the simple manse that was situated beside the little dilapidated church. The priest showed him the garden and taught him what to do. It was strange for the juggler. He'd been on the road, on the move, for so many years. travelling here, travelling there, hardly resting in one place for a few days at a time, and now to come to a standstill, a rest. And he found the joy of digging the potatoes out of the ground, the shallots that were there, and the green beans that were growing with their tendrils. He began to see things that he hadn't seen before, feel things that he hadn't felt before, being a wandering man. And he grew to love the evenings, sitting with the old priest by the fire and telling stories. The old priest told him a story about how he came to wear the cloth and then become a parish priest. And the juggler found the hard knot of cynicism that was around his heart began to crumble and melt away. And then one day, as he was digging in the garden, a young woman came with a scrawny child, skinny-legged, underfed, carrying a sack. And when the priest came out to greet her, he said, "Oh, why don't you leave your son with my friend here while we go into the garden?" And so the little boy went with the juggler into the kitchen while the priest led the woman with her sack out into the garden to gather vegetables and potatoes. And the little boy sat very solemn on a kitchen chair, and suddenly the juggler picked up a knife and fork and began to juggle. And then he picked up some saucers and cups, and the young boy was mesmerized, and he began to smile. And when the mother came back, she said, "I've never seen my son smile like this before." And so they left. But the winter went on, and suddenly one day the juggler came in and said, "I notice the parishioners are coming in, and there's quite an air of excitement in the air. What is that?" he asked the priest. And the priest said, "Oh, it's coming now to festival time. And this is the time when the people gather the gifts that they have to give to the Christ child." And so the juggler began to think. In the nights that he'd sat with the old priest, he'd told the old priest his story, how in the beginning he'd learned the way of acrobating, as well as being a juggler, from his parents. And they were invited to rich homes and palaces. And then his parents had grown old. His father had died. And then his mother, with a broken heart, died not long after. And something died in him. So he stopped tumbling. He found that people enjoyed his juggling, but he had no heart anymore to tumble and acrobat. So all his travels, he'd only been a juggler. But then, when he saw the people preparing their simple gifts to give, he wondered to himself, what can I give? Before this, he said to the priest, the church is dirty. Let me clean it up in preparedness for our festival day. So he went in. He started to scrub and polish the pews. He cleaned out all the old candles that were burned down with oil and put fresh candles. And then he looked and saw the statue of the Virgin Mary holding the child there. But just when he was cleaning, a young woman came into the church, and she went to the feet of the Virgin Mary, and tears were rolling down her face. She seemed to place something under the pedestal of the statue, and then bowing, saying a few words, she left. But when the juggler went there, he found a small, tiny sock, and he hurried after the woman, saying, "You've left this behind." And with tears in her eyes, she said, "I'm leaving it for the mother to take care of my child." So again the juggler, with tears rolling down his face, placed back the little sock under the statue. And then something came into him. Something shifted in him. And he went out to where all of the implements were kept for the girl. There was a space there. And he began to stretch. He stretched his limbs. And he began to tumble, like he did in the old days. And then the day of the festival came, and the people came with their gifts, some bringing just a little basket of leaves, some with acorns, and each one went to give their gift. But then only the juggler remained. But he walked resolutely up to the front of the church, and he began. First of all, he began to turn, and then he began to tumble. And first of all, the people said, "This is for the streets and the square, this is not for the church." But soon, every one of the people in that church were one with the tumbler. They were with him as he sprang and turned and twisted. And suddenly, the little boy who he had juggled for shouted, "Look! Look! The Virgin Mary is smiling." And everyone turned and saw that the somber statue holding the child had a gentle smile on its face, and everyone was in awe and wonder, because that smile remained. For years after, people would come from everywhere, not only to see the smiling statue of the Virgin Mary, but to join with the juggler as he tumbled and twisted and turned is this place that we arrive at when we no longer need to try? We still have our wooden leg. We still have the scars from childhood trauma. But what have we discovered, and what are we observing now as we find ourselves speaking with a voice that's like the tumbler? We found it. We found it. Have we refound it? Was it there all along and just tamped down by our pain and trauma? What is this voice? What is this voice that makes statues smile? Little boys find joy in it. People who have lost a loved one be embraced by it. What is it about you now? Was it there all along? Have we found in this place our tumbler? What's the meaning of this story?